for all of the law questions for your math classes 4 and 5. This is the solutions video for all of the law questions for your math classes 4 and 5. So question 173 is about prepayment, so the topic of prepayment. So if you don't remember, you actually did cover this in your mortgage law chapter earlier in your course. So just to refresh your memory, under the Interest Act, individuals or most businesses have the right to prepay all of the outstanding debt of their mortgage contract as long as it's 5 years from initiation of the mortgage and they pay this 3-month penalty. So when I say most businesses, you have to make sure that they're not talking about a corporation. Okay, so if it says it's for a corporation cannot do this. Corporations have to pay out all of the interest that they have remaining on a mortgage contract. They can't prepay. So what am I talking about prepay? What's the deal with this? Well, this part of the Interest Act gives you the ability to pay out your mortgage contract early and escape paying all of the interest that you might still have owing on it. But there are some restrictions on that. So if you had a 7-year term and 4 years in to that term, you won the lottery, okay? You have $25 million now that you've won, and you just want to get rid of this mortgage contract that you have the 7-year term for. So you've 4 years in, that means you have 3 years left, okay? Now, because the right to prepayment only applies 5 years after initiation of the mortgage, you couldn't prepay until you got to the point where there's 2 years left. Okay, so if you were 4 years in and there were 3 years left on your mortgage, you'd have to wait another year because you have to wait until it's 5 years after initiation of that contract. So 7-year contract means you can only prepay the remainder at the 2-year mark. Now, what is this all about? Why would you want to do this? Because if you prepay, let's say you have 1 year and 11 months left on your mortgage and you want to prepay what's left, you would pay the 3-month penalty that is required for the prepayment. And then you wouldn't need to pay the rest of the interest. So you pay 3 months, which would pay off 3 months out of this 1 year and 11 months left, and then you wouldn't have to pay the remaining 1 year and 8 months of interest. So that's what this is trying to do. This is the benefit of this prepayment part of the Interest Act. Now, again, you have to remember, it has to be 5 years from initiation. So that means if you have a 5-year term or less, that you actually cannot take advantage of this because you wouldn't be able to pay it out after 5 years because your contract would be over at the 5-year mark or less and you wouldn't be able to take advantage of it. So it has to be for terms that are longer than 5 years because you'd have to wait until after that 5-year mark. Okay, so number 2 is your correct answer. It's the right of the borrower to pay off all or some of the outstanding balance during the term of the mortgage. And you see that this is the key part here, during the term of the mortgage. So it has to be longer than a 5-year term because you have to do it after 5 years of initiation, okay? So number 1 is incorrect. It's referring to an acceleration clause. So that's describing the acceleration clause, the right of the lenders to demand full repayment of the outstanding principal if the payments fall into arrears. Number 3 is just describing the regular repayment clause that tells you how you're going to pay back your outstanding balance along with the interest. So the lender's right to demand full payment of the outstanding balance at the end of the term of a partially amortized mortgage. And then this one, I don't even know what they're talking about. They're talking about a finder's fee to a mortgage broker, which is made prior to the advancing of the mortgage funds. So that's not what the prepayment is about. It's the part of the Interest Act that tells you that you have the right to pay off all or some of the outstanding balance during the term of the mortgage, provided that it is prepaid after 5 years from initiation and you pay that 3-month penalty, and it's not for a corporation. So it can only be for individuals or businesses that are not incorporated. All right, so number 271, this one has shown up one other time previous to this, so hopefully you know this one already, but just in case you've forgotten, this is a nice little reminder. So this question is strangely worded. The question is actually asking you what is going to happen to this PV if you were to keep everything the same except for your interest rate. So I'm going to keep this $5,000 payment, I'm going to keep my amortization length, and I'm going to change from a 10%, a J1 equals 10, to a J1 equals 5, and they're asking what's going to happen to your PV. Well, when you lower the interest rate, you know that you're paying less in interest, so that means you're going to be able to purchase more with that $5,000 payment. So your PV should go up. It should increase if you were to decrease that interest rate. So think of it this way. If you had that $5,000 payment and it was at the 10%, okay, so we're talking about this first scenario here. If you split this payment in the principal and interest, the interest might be $3,700 and the principal portion, the PV portion that you're paying back, would then be $1,300. if we were to reduce that to the 5%, then what do you think would happen? Well, it makes sense that the interest would decrease. So let's say that you're going to pay $2,200 in interest instead, and your PV then would increase quite significantly to $2,800. So you could buy more PV with this $5,000 payment if less of it had to go towards interest. Now, a lot of people say, I don't even know what you just said. Just stop talking. I don't understand. Well, if you're not sure about what one of these questions is asking and what the answer is, then the best thing to do is to actually do the math. So that's why I have my calculator beside me, even when I'm doing my math law questions, and why I have this little grid that's set up so that we can do the solving, and I can show you that the PV will increase when I decrease that interest rate. Okay, so I'm going to solve for the first one to start, using my J1 equals 10 and all of my loan terms, and then I'll solve the second one, and you can see that the PV will go up quite a bit because I'm allowed to buy more with that with that payment amount. Okay, so first one, I'm going to use my 10%. So I'm going to plug in my other three values, and I push my PV, and I get 42,567 and some pennies. Okay, the pennies don't matter for this one because it's going to be quite different. Okay, so now instead of solving with a J1 equals 10, I'm going to solve for J1 equals 5, and I'm going to see what that payment will buy me based on this interest rate. So I do my repepin to start, plug in my other three values, and I have to keep them the same, right? I can't change them, or else that will change the math. And you see that when you do that, it actually significantly increases the amount that the borrower could get with this $5,000. Okay, so this $5,000 will buy only $42,500 worth of PV because I'm paying 10% in interest. Whereas this $5,000 will buy just over $62,000 in PV because I'm paying only 5% in interest. Okay, so it's another way to say these two things, to prove those two things. And this math actually proves that what I was thinking about the answer is true. Best way to do it is to try and do some math. Okay, 329 says, as a marketing incentive to speed up the sale of newly completed but unsold condominiums, a developer agrees to provide the purchasers with first mortgages with a contract rate that is lower than the market rate of interest. So under these circumstances, it can be said that this is an offer involving what? So it's involving below rate financing, and this is actually referring to our PIMP situation, right? Where we have two different interest rates. The lender or the developer in this situation, usually it's the seller in our PIMPO questions, but in this situation it's the developer. They are offering a lower than market rate as opposed to that higher market rate. Now, which one would you want? Definitely this one, if it's an option, right? I don't want to pay double the interest. I want to pay the lower interest. So sometimes when the market is slow, developers or even sellers will volunteer to provide some or all of the funds to purchase in order to entice a buyer, and they'll do it at a lower than market rate. So we call that below rate financing. Okay, so given that all other factors are identical, the longer the term of a contract on a bonused, partially amortized mortgage will do what, or will have what effect? So the answer is that it will lower the effective interest rate by the borrower. And you're probably telling me, well, you talked about in some other questions previously that the term length doesn't affect anything other than the outstanding balance. Yes, that's usually true. Most of the time that's true. But because we are talking about a bonused mortgage, so the bonus is being paid by the borrower, and this is our AP questions, okay, where that bonus is being paid by the borrower, the term actually does affect the IYR in this situation. And the reason for that is because the bonuses that are put onto that mortgage, onto the loan, are typically paid back by the end of that term length. And the borrower is also paying interest on that bonused amount for the length of the amortization. So they're paying interest in that term length as well. So a longer term means that it'll be a lower IYR because you're going to spread the repayment of those bonuses over a longer term. If you shrink that term length, then that means that you're going to increase that IYR even more because you're shortening the time that you can have to pay back those bonuses in that shorter term. So again, how would you know that what you're thinking is true? Well, you can do the math. So the answer choice that's correct is lower. It lowers the effective rate with a shorter term to pay back those bonuses. So the other one is higher effective rate. It doesn't have any effect on the monthly payment, and it doesn't affect the outstanding balance at the term's end, because in this case, we're lengthening the term, so it would actually be a lower outstanding balance. So that's why number 4 is incorrect. So we're down to the lowering the effective rate, or is it going to be a higher effective rate? Well, how do you do it? How do you prove it? You do the math. So I've got a question here that's from your book, and we are going to solve the question normally using the info in the question, and it has a 5-year term, and then I'm going to solve it again, and I'm going to plug in a 7-year term and see what happens to that interest rate at the very end. So you see that I have one side here, I've got the page split. I'm going to solve it, and one side is going to be the 5-year term that's listed in the question, and then the second version I'm going to solve for the 7-year term to see what happens when I lengthen that term length. Is my effective rate, is that final interest rate going to be lower than the one that we get on this side? It should be. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to prove here. So I go ahead and start my MPEPIN and solve for the question using my loan terms. Now I've gotten everything out here and already written onto the page so that it doesn't take as much time. So 1283.78, it doesn't tell us how to round up, so we go ahead and round it up to the next higher penny, and we plug that back in. Now my second step is my nuggets and fries, right? So 5 shift and future value, and you get 93,774 with a bunch more decimals, and then we have to put in over the PB the amount that the borrower is actually getting, and then we can push our IYR. So we get 15.512 with a bunch more decimals, and then it's asking for an effective rate at the end. And just to see that I've got the right answer, I'm going to go all the way to the end of the solution, and you see that I do have the right answer. Okay, so 16.6638 is my J1. That's my effective rate. So my theory is that if I stretch the bonus amount, if I stretch the $2,500 and the $750 over a longer period of time, it's not going to bump up my interest rate as much because I have more time to pay that amount off. So let's go ahead and solve the question again. Instead, we'll put in a 7-year term in the second half there in our PP and see what happens to that interest rate. I have the same payment amount. It shouldn't have changed because nothing has changed so far. This is where it's going to change. So instead of plugging in my 5 years, I'm going to plug in my 7. So 7 shift N, and then I press future value, which gives me a lower outstanding balance than my first one, and it should because I've made more payments. Then I plug in that 96,750 over top of my PV, and I push my IYR. And you see that you get 15.338. So you can see that it's already less, right, than the J12. And when I hit my shift effective, I get 16.4636 and a bunch more decimals. So it's not off by much, but it is about 0.2%, right? 0.2% difference. If I spread those bonuses over 2 more years, as opposed to the 5 years in the question, it does actually lower that effective rate that the borrower is going to pay. Okay, 345 is basically the same question, but flipped. So it's opposite. So it's asking in this question, if the borrower only gets this 22,500, but the face value is actually 24,000 that they're going to pay, then what is going to happen to the effective rate of interest charged on the funds? So for this one, again, we're talking about a PP mortgage, right, or a PP question, and our borrower is going to throw those fees, they're going to add those fees onto the face value of the loan. So they're going to pay for interest on the 24,000, but they're only going to get the 22,500. And so what happened when we actually did the question, so I'm going to go back to this question here quickly. When we solved this question, and we did our first MPEPIN, which you can't see now, so I'm going to do this to show you what the interest rate is. So it's 14.5516 when you convert this to a J12. And you see that at the end, it bumped it up to 15.51. So it bumped it up almost a full percent. Not quite, but almost a full percentage. So because they bonused their mortgage and they're paying interest on these fees, the rate that's on paper is not what they're actually paying. This is the rate that they're actually paying. Okay, so they're paying slightly higher than the contract rate because they've added some stuff onto their mortgage. So that's what this question is actually asking about. What's going to happen to that rate if we add some things onto our mortgage and we have a higher face value than what the borrower is going to get? So answer number 3 is going to be greater than the effective annual interest rate of the contract interest rate. Okay, so it is possible. Right, we just proved it. You can do a math question. It's not going to be less than, and it's not going to be equal to. So it'll be greater than the effective annual equivalent of the contract interest rate. That is your correct answer. Okay, so question 435 says, given that all other factors are identical, the shorter the term of the contract on a bonused, partially amortized mortgage will do what? So this one is the opposite of the one that we did previously. So the last one, that 2 questions ago, the one that we did 2 questions ago, it said what's going to happen to the interest rate if it's a longer term. This one is saying it's a shorter term. So when we lengthened the term, when we added more years onto the term, what happened to the rate? It actually lowered the rate. So in this case, if we shorten the amount of years on the term, what's going to happen to the interest rate? It's going to go up. And again, if you weren't sure, you could go ahead and get a question, solve it, and then shorten the term on that question and solve it again and see what happens to the interest rate at the very end. The APR is the borrower's contractual interest rate plus any non-interest finance charges. So the APR is what we say is the total cost to the borrower. It includes all of the fees and the interest. When we use all of our other interest rates, it doesn't actually reflect the fees that might be included. And nominal is one of the words that are specifically used to refer to an interest rate that doesn't include those fees. Okay, so it doesn't actually reflect any of the fees that might be payable that the borrower might have to pay to that lender. Okay, so the APR is not a requirement under the Federal Interest Act. We'll do a question in a minute and you'll see what legislation requires it. It's not also known as the stated interest rate. That's just silly. And it's not an interest rate that must be expressed with semi-annual compounding. It can actually be expressed in J1 or J2, but usually it's in a J1. So yeah, just remember that it's the total cost. It includes the fees, okay, as opposed to the nominal that doesn't include the fees. Okay, so 884 is about portable mortgages. So if you don't remember what a portable mortgage is from the video, and what video am I talking about? Oh, this one again. So this one is really important to watch a couple of times. It'll really help you with these math law questions when you get into these. So portable mortgages are for the owner. So the current owner has a mortgage. It's got a portable clause in there. It allows the owner of that property to port over the terms and their existing conditions and rate and all the benefits, all the things that they like in that mortgage. It allows them to port it over to another property. So it gives the owner the flexibility to sell their home and have another one that they want to purchase before the mortgage contract ends. So you don't have to pay the fees. You don't have to exit one contract and get into the other and renegotiate and all of that kind of stuff. So sometimes owners will actually give a vendor supplied mortgage. If they have a portable mortgage, they may not want to do that. They might want to keep those mortgage terms and that mortgage for themselves because they may want to port it over to their new property that they're thinking of purchasing or that they already have purchased. Okay, so for this one, the correct answer is that a borrower can save money when the existing mortgage has a lower interest rate than current market rates. Absolutely, right? If you had a 7-year term on your current mortgage and you wanted to sell 2 or 3 years in, you might want to keep that interest rate if the interest rates, if the current market rates had gone up a bit. Number 1 is actually describing a purchaser taking over responsibility for the remaining contractual terms of an existing mortgage. So this one is describing an assumed mortgage. And like I was saying, if you're talking about a portable mortgage, you don't want somebody to assume it. You want to keep it for yourself. Number 3 is kind of talking about the same thing, right? Vendor supplied mortgages. Portable mortgage is not a vendor supplied mortgage. Assumed mortgage, vendor take back mortgage, and agreement for sale are all vendor supplied mortgages. And the portable funds fee is always charged. Not true. It could be, but a lot of times the whole reason for porting your mortgage to your next property is so that you can actually save those fees and not actually pay them. Okay, so which one of the following statements concerning the Business Practices and Consumer Protection Act, so the BPCPA, is false? So they're asking for the false statement here, and that is answer number 3, so that one's false. A disclosure statement must be given to the borrower 6 days prior to the borrower incurring an obligation under a credit agreement unless the time period is waived by the borrower. So that phrase is okay except for the 6 days part. It's actually 2 days prior. So everything else about it is all right, except for the fact that they say 6 days. So that means that these 3 are true statements, so you need to pay attention to those. So number 1 says mortgage lenders and brokers must disclose the annual percentage rate to the borrower. So remember in one of the previous questions, it said the Federal Interest Act was what required the disclosure. That was false. It is the BPCPA that actually requires the disclosure. Number 2 says the annual percentage rate represents the borrower's contractual interest rate plus any non-interest finance charges. That is true. So those fees that might be included by the lender. And number 4 says, in order to provide borrowers with some help in determining the actual cost of borrowing, most provincial governments in Canada have legislated that certain disclosure requirements must be met for specific types of mortgages. So that's true. And that is the reason why we have disclosure requirements, so that it's easy or easier for borrowers to know exactly what it is that they have to pay and what it's going to cost them in the end.